Jada Pinkett Smith exposes Diddy's disturbing loyalty contract. You'll regret it in the next life. It was a day the court expected to unfold like the others' testimony. Cross-examinations and the standard legal back and forth that had defined the high-stakes trial against entertainment magnate Sean Diddy Combs. But what transpired would reshape the narrative and ignite headlines across the nation. Without prior warning, the bailiff called a new name to the witness stand, Jada Pinkett Smith. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Known for her work in film activism, and as the wife of actor Will Smith, Jada's presence was entirely unanticipated. Even the prosecution appeared momentarily caught off guard, suggesting her appearance was not arranged through official channels. Dressed in a somber black suit, she walked forward with quiet determination. She paused, took the oath, and faced the jury directly. "I know this is unusual," she said, "but I can't stay silent anymore." What followed was a revelation that shifted the entire direction of the trial. Jada began her account by returning to the year 2004, when she was invited by Diddy to a private meeting under the guise of discussing a charitable initiative focused on music and community engagement. It seemed legitimate, even commendable. The meeting took place in a luxury suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. The setting, she noted, was calm but unsettling. Dimmed lights, closed curtains, soft jazz from a speaker in the corner. Diddy greeted her dressed in all-white, offering champagne, which she declined. The conversation started with small talk, harmless, even pleasant. But then, without warning, he stepped to a bar and returned with a black leather folder. He handed it to her without explanation. Inside, Jada expected to find a proposal or a partnership agreement. What she found instead stunned her, a document labeled loyalty agreement. Initially, she thought it was a joke. She recalled laughing and asking, "What is this? Some kind of hip-hop spiritual club?" But Diddy didn't laugh. Instead, he responded with a calm and cryptic phrase, "It's protection for both of us." As she flipped through the pages, the tone of the document chilled her. It wasn't a legal agreement. There were no firm logos or legal disclaimers. But the language was precise and deeply unsettling. She described clauses demanding lifelong discretion over all personal and professional dealings, with phrases that evoked spiritual submission and silence across all transition of existence. Another section referenced a concept of legacy preservation through unwavering obedience. Some phrases, she said, sounded ancient, more like a ritual pact than a contract. What struck her most was a signature line already pre-filled with her name. "I felt sick," she told the jury. "It was like I was being recruited for something I didn't understand." She returned the folder to him and said no. That's when the atmosphere in the room changed. According to Jada, Diddy's tone dropped, his expression turned grave, and he leaned in with a line that would follow her for the rest of her life. "You'll regret it in the next life." The jury leaned in. Reporters stopped typing. Even the judge remained motionless. Jada clarified that she couldn't tell if the statement was metaphorical or literal. But it wasn't a joke. It felt like a warning. Like something had just been set in motion, she said. At that point in court, the defense interrupted, attempting to dismiss her statement as irrelevant. But the judge, noting the possibility of corroboration with other witness testimonies, allowed her to proceed. Jada continued with a level voice, recounting how she left that hotel, shaken, trembling so hard she could barely put her key in the ignition of her car. "I knew then this wasn't just about power," she said. "This was about control. Deep control." Back in court, Jada began reciting phrases from the loyalty agreement. Phrases, she said, were etched in her memory, even though the physical copy had long since vanished. She believed it had been stolen from her home years ago. One phrase stood out to the room. "The undersigned agrees to uphold confidentiality, not only in this life, but in all spiritual transitions thereafter." Another, "Any knowledge gained in sacred space shall remain sacred, never to be uttered in earthly court, church, or public sphere." Jada said she remembered nervously joking, "Is this contract supposed to follow me into the afterlife?" To which Diddy allegedly replied, "You're starting to get it." The courtroom sat in near total silence. Some jurors appeared visibly uncomfortable. Others glanced nervously at the defense table, where Diddy sat, still eyes locked forward. According to Jada, the document also included references to a hierarchy levels of loyalty tests of silence, and repeated mentions of something called the selection. Though never defined, it was emphasized multiple times throughout the pages. She emphasized to the jury that she was fully sober during the 2004 meeting, and that nothing about what she described was exaggerated. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't theater, she said. He believed in it, and he believed I would sign. She didn't, and that refusal changed everything. At that moment in court, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the narrative of the entire case. Jada Pinkett Smith wasn't just a celebrity voice, she was a turning point. And as the judge called a short recess, one thing became clear: this was no longer just a courtroom drama. It was a dismantling of silence, one sentence at a time. When court resumed, the atmosphere remained heavy. Jada Pinkett Smith had just introduced a new dimension to the ongoing trial. Not just another accusation, but the framework of something larger, more systemic, and far more chilling. What had been viewed as an isolated pattern of misconduct was now being reframed with her testimony as the keystone. She spoke again, this time with more resolve. After I refused to sign that agreement, she said something followed me. Not physically, but energetically. I walked out of that hotel, but a piece of that moment never left. The prosecutor gently asked if she'd experienced any retaliation. Jada nodded. It wasn't loud, she explained. It was subtle. That's how it works. It's not a blacklist. It's a quiet erasure. She described how in the years after that 2004 meeting, she began to notice changes. Calls that once came frequently slowed, then stopped. Producers who had once shown enthusiasm became suddenly distant. She'd attend events and feel invisible. Opportunities slipped away without explanation. Nothing was overt, she said, but everything felt orchestrated. Then came the emotional weight. Jada described years of second guessing, of wondering if she had misinterpreted the moment, until she started seeing a pattern, not just with herself, but with others. She told the court she began quietly observing which women in the industry rose, which ones fell, and which ones simply vanished. Certain faces faded from red carpets. Some became distant. Others, still in the public eye, appeared guarded, almost hollow. I began to notice a look, she said, a specific kind of quiet in the eyes, like something had been signed and sealed inside them. The jury took notes. Spectators leaned forward. Jada explained that the loyalty agreement had specific phrases that suggested spiritual permanence, references to vows, not just of discretion, but of existential submission. It didn't ask for assets, it asked for compliance, indefinitely. She paraphrased another section: to break silence is to break the bond. Breaking the bond carries consequences divine and otherwise. It sounded like fiction, but she was calm, measured. And the gravity of her words resonated. I used to tell myself I imagined it, but the more I saw, the more I realized I hadn't imagined anything. I just caught a glimpse of something I wasn't meant to see. When asked by the prosecution why she chose to speak, now Jada responded with clarity. Because I watched others testify. I heard echoes of my own experience in their words. It wasn't just me, it was a system. And I knew I had to confirm it. Her testimony was far from over. What came next would bolster her credibility even further. The prosecution introduced 2 additional documents, recovered loyalty agreements, allegedly given to other former employees of Diddy. One belonged to a former assistant from 2007. The other, an ex-dancer on tour in 2010. Both documents, while differing in format and structure, shared disturbing similarities, language about lifelong silence, spiritual alignment, and the mission of legacy. One even included the phrase, "the contract is sacred, beyond time." The courtroom shifted as jurors compared the documents side by side. Gasps could be heard as more people absorbed the implications. Jada sat quietly as a forensic handwriting expert was called to testify. The expert confirmed that annotations found on all three documents, underlined passages, cryptic symbols, and handwritten notes were consistent with Diddy's handwriting. One symbol in particular, a stylized eye encased in a circle, appeared in all three. When asked if she recognized it, Jada nodded. "He called it the Watcher," she said. "He told me it was what protected him, and what punished those who betrayed the mission." Diddy's legal team quickly objected, but the judge allowed the testimony citing corroboration and forensic validation. As the court adjourned for the day, a realization had taken hold. This wasn't just a celebrity scandal. It was beginning to resemble a covert structure, one rooted in secrecy, loyalty, and submission. And Jada's voice had cracked it open. The following morning, courtroom attendance swelled. Reporters, legal analysts, and observers packed the gallery, aware that what they were witnessing might reshape the entertainment industry's understanding of power and silence. The focus returned to Jada Pinkett Smith as she resumed her position on the stand, composed, deliberate, and unwavering. From the moment she began, it was clear she had returned not just to finish telling her truth, but to illuminate a far more complex web. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," she said. "It was part of something larger, something woven into the structure of the industry." She described a slow but persistent realization that certain parties' invitations and affiliations operated under their own unspoken language, a language she learned to read and eventually to avoid. There were phrases she explained, terms like the upstairs room or bring your aura. They weren't innocent. They were coded. They indicated you were being brought closer to something hidden. She recounted attending public events where glances between female artists carried unspoken warnings, where assistants would whisper details about who was hosting and whether one should stay or leave early. If the host was Diddy, she said that meant something else entirely. The prosecutor asked whether she ever spoke about her experience before testifying. Jada admitted that for years she kept it to herself. Not even her husband, Will Smith, knew. "I was afraid," she said plainly. "Not for my safety. For my credibility. For my sanity." But that fear eventually gave way to cautious action. She revealed that in 2016 she quietly warned a small group of fellow female artists during a private lunch. Among them, Beyoncé and Solange. No press, no phones, no handlers, just a protected space for truth. "I didn't tell them everything," she said, "but I told them enough to protect them." She remembered telling the group, "If anyone ever offers you something spiritual, something about legacy or loyalty, and it comes from Diddy or someone close to him, don't just say no. Leave. Don't look back." Her words drew quiet astonishment from the gallery. This wasn't just about testifying anymore. It was about bearing witness for others. "I wasn't the only one offered the agreement," she continued. "I was just one of the few who said no," and walked away. The prosecution asked if others had confided in her. Jada paused, then nodded. "Yes," quietly, privately. They were scared. They didn't want their names out there. But their stories were like mine, almost identical. She emphasized that these pacts weren't presented as threats. They were framed as opportunities, she said, as gateways to a higher circle. But underneath the language, you could feel the pressure. You could feel the threat. And that threat, Jada explained, didn't always take the form of career sabotage. Sometimes it was social withdrawal, reputational damage. Other times it was less tangible, a spiritual unease, a sense that privacy had vanished. She recounted how her own life was marked by a series of inexplicable events. Strange phone calls, unmarked vehicles outside her home, calls with no voice on the other end, a whispered message. Nothing. Just breathe. "I started journaling," she admitted, trying to process it. "But even the journal didn't feel safe. I eventually burned it." The courtroom was riveted. Diddy, seated at the defense table, appeared increasingly tense. He rubbed his temples, shifted in his seat, and whispered to his legal team. But nothing he said could stop what was unfolding. As Jada spoke, the public outside the courthouse began to respond. Social media exploded with reactions. Influencers, fans, and fellow celebrities posted cryptic messages, some offering subtle support, others in denial, and still others retreating into silence. The phrase, "you'll regret it in the next life," trended within hours. Analysts began connecting dots. Journalists revisited old stories, disappearing careers, sudden contract voids, artists who had once seemed poised for greatness and then vanished from view. Jada's testimony had become a touchstone. And as she sat back in her seat finishing her third day on the stand, one thing became evident: this wasn't just about what Diddy may or may not have done. It was about the invisible infrastructure that allowed it to happen. The symbols, the silence, the system. As the trial entered its next phase, the energy inside the courtroom began to shift. The air of spectacle had given way to an atmosphere of reckoning. Diddy, once composed and assured, now sat with tightened shoulders and furrowed brow. His team whispered furiously, their motions more frequent, their requests for sidebars increasingly urgent. But the most defining change was not procedural. It was emotional. Because Jada Pinkett Smith had fundamentally altered the terrain. Her testimony had not merely accused a powerful man, it had unmasked a mythology. The myth that loyalty in the entertainment world was organic. That connections were built on trust. That influence stemmed from merit. What she had described was something else entirely: a belief system masquerading as a brand. The court reconvened after a brief recess. The prosecution called attention once more to the forensic evidence. A handwriting analyst took the stand and walked the jury through a side-by-side comparison of 3 documents: Jada's paraphrased agreement and the 2 physical contracts recovered from other witnesses. In each, the same stylized annotations appeared: the eye, the circle, the cryptic language. According to the analyst, the markings bore a strong and consistent resemblance to Diddy's known handwriting samples. Diddy's lead counsel objected. The judge overruled, citing the totality of evidence and the relevance of repeated patterns. At this point, tension in the room became visible. One spectator had to be escorted out after fainting. Journalists, usually composed, began writing with a sense of urgency, as though racing the clock. Every word felt heavier. And then Jada returned to the stand for what would be her final day of testimony. "I want the jury to understand," she said, voice calm. "This wasn't just paperwork. This wasn't just philosophy. It was control. Control packaged in ritual, delivered through silence, enforced by reputation." She described moments on red carpets where a glance from Diddy would freeze conversation. She spoke about hearing stories of rising talents who abruptly fell off the radar after declining invitations. She described how saying no didn't bring consequences immediately, but eventually it brought isolation. "Some people never said no," she said. "They stayed in his orbit. But they never looked free again." Then she turned toward Diddy, not with anger, but with finality. "You always said I'd regret saying no. But look around. I'm here on this stand in front of the world, and you're the one on trial." He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. It was the first moment he seemed truly without words. The room froze. The prosecution rested her segment. The judge called a 10-minute break, but nobody left their seat. Even silence had weight now. Outside the courthouse, the ripple effect accelerated. News headlines reframed the case. Jada links Diddy to cult-like loyalty contracts. Editorial boards called for further investigation. Publicists fielded questions they never expected. A major fashion brand quietly shelved a campaign. A streaming platform removed curated playlists overnight. The dominoes were falling, and Diddy's defense appeared unprepared for the speed. Because what had begun as a series of legal allegations had evolved into something far more destabilizing: a cultural audit. The trial was no longer just about individual actions. It was about the structure that allowed those actions to persist. And in the middle of it all stood Jada, no longer silent, no longer afraid. The final phase of the week's proceedings brought not a new witness, but echoes of the one who had just stepped down. Jada Pinkett Smith's testimony had ignited a chain reaction, one that would soon ripple far beyond the courtroom and into boardrooms, talent agencies, and private conversations that had, until now, remained buried in fear. As court resumed, murmurs from the gallery were quickly hushed. The judge addressed the room with gravity. "We are entering a sensitive juncture. The court asks all parties to maintain decorum." It was a procedural statement, but everyone in the room knew it was also a warning, because silence was no longer protecting anyone. It was now incriminating them. The prosecution submitted supplemental evidence messages, emails, and timestamped documents, suggesting that multiple celebrities and executives may have been approached with loyalty agreements similar in tone, if not in form. The names were redacted, but the patterns were unmistakable. Diddy's legal team pushed back, insisting these were circumstantial, speculative, and irrelevant. But the court allowed it to stand for review, for investigation, and for what the judge called necessary transparency. Outside, the media frenzy had reached new heights. Networks ran side-by-side comparisons of Jada's paraphrased phrases and the recovered documents. Analysts broke down the symbol of the watcher. Podcasts dissected the cultural impact of her words. Even daytime TV often removed from such weighty matters devoted entire segments to the spiritual language embedded in the contracts. But inside the courtroom, the tension returned to one focal point: accountability. Because as much as the trial was about Diddy, it was now also about who had looked away, who had known and chosen silence, who had benefited from proximity without questioning the cost. In her closing remarks, the prosecution did not raise her voice. She didn't deliver a dramatic flourish. Instead, she leaned into the silence, the same silence that had protected so much for so long. "This case is not just about misconduct," she said. "It's about the infrastructure that allowed it. An infrastructure hidden behind music, fashion, philanthropy, and fear." She turned to the jury. "You've heard from those who signed, and from those who walked away. The question before you now is not whether a contract was enforceable. The question is, what was being enforced?" Jada, sitting behind the prosecution's bench, now remained still. No smile, no tears, just presence. Because what had started as a deeply personal story, her refusal to sign a document, had expanded into something far more consequential. She had spoken not just for herself, but for those who hadn't found their voice yet. And the aftermath had proven her testimony wasn't just credible, it was catalytic. In the days following her appearance, sources close to the district attorney's office confirmed an uptick in anonymous tips. Some came from former staffers, others from names once considered untouchable. All hinted at a structure deeper and wider than previously imagined. Jada, for her part, returned to silence. She declined interviews, released no statements. Her spokesperson simply said, "She said what she needed to say. The rest belongs to the system now." But that silence was different. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. Because her words, "silence protects him," had changed the equation. She had refused the contract, and in doing so, she had broken its spell. As proceedings adjourned, the judge issued a final note of caution. "Let the public understand the implications of this trial may extend beyond this courtroom." He wasn't wrong. Across the city, closed-door meetings were being held. Contracts were being reviewed. Calendars were being cleared. Agents were asking new questions. And in the minds of viewers around the world, one phrase refused to fade. "You'll regret it in the next life." Not anymore. Because now, for the first time, someone had said no and survived. And that in itself had become the turning point of the story. Not just for Jada Pinkett Smith, but for everyone who had ever been handed the folder and dared to wonder what would happen if they didn't sign.